Welcome to How's That Working For You, a podcast for the therapy curious. I'm your host, Dr. Zoe Krupka. Lived experience. In mental health, it's now a ubiquitous term to refer to those challenges, identities, adverse and traumatic experiences that we share with our clients. What do you think of when you think of lived experience? Especially as a mental health practitioner, whatever species of mental health professional you are, how do you think about your own lived experiences, the ones you share with your clients? I think one of the reasons this season of How's That Working For You is so focused on the lived and living experiences of practitioners, clients, and consultants is because this is such a fraught area for us. On the one hand, there's so much focus on being trauma-informed, on being respectful of where our clients come from, of how we respond to them, how our organizations treat people. But for therapists, the idea that we have our own lived and living experiences, particularly of abuse, neglect, of family violence and mental illness, is, if not taboo, something we really are often punished for. And when I say punished, I'm talking about those practitioners you may have read about who have been sanctioned for sharing their lived experiences on social media, been reported to boards, assumed as not competent, and accused of bringing their professions into disrepute. So I'm really interested today in talking to the multi-talented Beck Harris today about her experience of how lived and living experience comes into the therapy room, and for us to really talk about the nitty-gritty of not only what lived experience can do in the room for and against us, but how our ideas about identity and adverse childhood experiences in therapists and all mental health professionals have the potential to really transform our professions. So tell me, because you do a lot of things, Beck Harris, what is it you do? Tell us about yourself.
I do lots of things because that's how I like to work. So I have a small private practice where I see people across the lifespan, and so I have rooms in northern suburbs of Melbourne and then online. And then when I'm not doing that, I'm often out in the world delivering professional learning, doing talks and that kind of thing, often in education. My background's in education, so student wellbeing, trauma-informed practice, youth mental health, staff wellbeing, all of that kind of thing. So I love the combination of those two things because some of it's quite, the one-on-one work is really great, but going out into the world and talking to groups is also really fabulous. And I'm an author and I have a book called Safe to Learn, embedding trauma-informed student wellbeing practices. And I've got inklings of a second book coming too.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yes.
Because the first book, just in case anybody's wondering, is awesome, and the uptake has been really encouraging, I think.
I really like to take complicated ideas and make them as simple as possible and accessible and then practical.
Oh, well, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you, was that I think this is, talking about lived experience with practitioners is in some ways a complicated idea, but one of the things you do really well, and you do really well in your book and your work, is exactly that, to sort of boil it down.
Well, it's interesting actually starting in education and spending a long time in education, because you have to bring yourself to school. Like, there isn't really an option.
There's no option.
Yeah, so then moving into, studying counselling and psychotherapy, you bring yourself into the counselling room too, and yet the expectations are quite different.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit, because you've come like as an educator, and I haven't taught in high school, so I'm thinking about myself as a high school student when you talk about that. How much we wanted to know about our teachers,
Yes.
how much appropriate and inappropriate digging we did about their lives, and then that huge jump to learning to be a counselor where somehow you're supposed to hive that all off.
It's really interesting thinking about the comparison actually, because, you know, my work in schools, the majority of my work was working with really marginalised communities, and certainly not kids who could afford to go off and have therapy, or necessarily whose families would think that was an okay thing to do even. So making school a therapeutic environment was really, really important to me and my colleagues. And that is all relational, of course. And part of that relational work was us expressing our care and being helpful and engaged, connecting with parents, and really absolutely bringing ourselves, and sometimes, you know, taking too much home, and, you know, it was really extremely stressful, amazing, powerful work. But, you know, when we're learning to be counsellors, the rate at which you disclose things about yourself and your own life is completely different to my experience at school.
Yeah, and one of the, when we were first talking about this, I remember that we started about hearing Dan Siegel, the psychiatrist, what is he, a neuroscientist, attachment specialist. I'm so sorry if I've got that wrong.
Human, yep.
And he was talking on a really great podcast, Therapists Uncensored, about how he had never, and this is like in a 30 or 40 year career talking about children's mental health and attachment, he had never spoken of his father's extreme violence. And he had made this promise to his mother that he would never speak about it. And she had died. And for the first time, he had spoken of it. And we talked about how, what a relief that was to hear. And the kind of mystery that it solved about his interest. And so I wonder if you could talk about what you think we might lose when we do that, when we kind of keep those secrets about ourselves, what we might lose in our work, with our clients, because I'm really thinking about that big picture of the role that lived experiences play in our work.
Yeah, that was a really, it felt like a significant moment to me, definitely, to hear that about someone who I admire so much, and I quote him all the time, and I love his work. He's got an amazing mind. But to hear also that he lived it just added something. So I think the loss is somewhere in that space around a really embodied understanding of things. And I don't think we need to have that to have compassion and empathy. But when we do have it, it is an additional kind of gift, I think, in a relational sense of just understanding at a different level.
Yeah, I remember sitting there thinking, sort of going back into a lot of the key ideas that really had touched me, from his work, and thinking that it kind of also answered that question of how does he know that? And of course he is a researcher, and he talked to a lot of people and was a practitioner. It wasn't just what had happened for him, but there was something, as you say, about that embodied knowing. And it also really kind of helped me understand how I've kept secrets, you know, how there seem to be taboo experiences. Some lived experiences, quote unquote, are acceptable, and some are really taboo. You know, like I often think, okay, I might talk about having experienced depression, but I'm less likely to talk about a childhood that was really characterized by severe violence. That's something I feel more, you know, here I am talking about it now, but I feel more reluctant. You know, what do you think about that idea that some things are okay? It's all right for you to have some lived experiences, but not others.
Absolutely. I think this is maybe now is a time when we're starting to talk about these things more. I'm not sure why. I think I'm curious. Is part of it, you know, the rise of more women, you know, who we're really looking up to, and amazing researchers and practitioners. I don't know. Maybe it's also, you know, just starting to value lived experience generally. And but often what happens is organisations will employ people in that role of lived experience, and they are separate. It's a separate role. So to be able to be a practitioner who's got a range of lived experiences, because we all do, is, you know, really important. But yes, absolutely, some of the things we express and some we don't. And I, you know, think about just the same for me. So I think being a queer practitioner, for example, is something that I would reference on my website or my Psychology Today profile, and people come to me because of that. And it's incredibly powerful and important, and it really genuinely makes a difference to people to know that that's an experience that I've got, and people tell me that all the time. And when I work with children or, you know, young adults, for them to see an older person who's got a successful life and who has been through the coming out process and all of that stuff as well is really important. But yeah, I would not be putting on my profile that I had, you know, early traumatic experiences either. And yet, why do I have a strong interest in childhood trauma? Because it happened to me, same as for most of us. And statistically, as, well, a human, but you know, as someone born female too, like the chances, I don't know what the current statistics are. The Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study had it, you know, very high chances of having experienced childhood maltreatment and, you know, sexual abuse at 1 in 3 or something, particularly for queer people, actually. So yeah, that's for me when I think about that difference of what's taboo and what's not. And yet there are two pieces of lived experience that I have that I think contribute to my capacity, but one is easy to talk about and one's not.
And, you know, and something you say there that's kind of so important, and I experience this as that kind of same split, I think, that I'm allowed to, in a way, see a disclosure of being a queer person as, you know, helping to create safety, to create connection, to, you know, help to kind of advertise understanding, but in the same way that I wouldn't say, hey, I know violence.
Yeah.
You know, I know violence, I know sexual assault, I know, And of course, the criticism we so often hear is, well, you know yours, you don't know someone else's. Well, you know your queerness, not someone else's.
Exactly.
However, there is something in what you're saying where we're talking about not necessarily leveling the playing field, but changing this idea of us as kind of untarnished or repaired. The idea that, well, you can have those experiences, but they need to be fixed now. And of course, there are parts of those things that never repair. I mean, what do you think about how those experiences you've had help to create, a softening of that power differential with clients?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I think for me generally, and my approach and the way that I work is very much walking alongside. And I chose not to study psychology and instead to study counselling and psychotherapy because that's where I'm much more aligned. So I think that that maybe my experiences have led me more in that direction too, that it is important to me to have that, to not have that power differential of I'm the expert because I know the theory and you're the person who has the experience, but to bring that blend, which is something I think I do well, of I love the theory, I love data, I love research, but unless I can interpret it through a practical life relational lens, then I'm not particularly interested in it. So, I have a really strong interest in a lot of areas of psychological theory, but only or particularly where it relates very practically. So I think that was probably in me already, and then I bring it to my work. And I know, it's not uncommon for me to say, I think, to a client, in my experience, because I think it's helpful to hear that. And it's not me telling a story about my experience. It's just generally saying, if particularly with psychoeducation, here's the theory that I can tell you, hopefully in a simple way that makes a lot of sense, but also I can tell you it works because I've lived it as well.
I like that you talk about that sort of the detail of what happens in the room, because I think that's a place where so often we get confused or stuck, or our training doesn't support us, which is with that idea of, as you say, it's not you saying, well, let me tell you.
No.
Let me tell you about my mother.
Yeah.
That's kind of the stereotype where, there are so many bad therapists in the media generally. Like, we could do a whole show on bad therapists on television, but that's the sort of myth.
Yeah.
But you're talking about bringing it in a very different way. In my experience, I know it worked. Can you say more about that? Because I feel like we don't have a lot of conversations. We talk about good and bad self-disclosure, but not like, what does it look like?
Yeah, it's really interesting thinking about what I thought I might be like when it came to self-disclosure, and then what I actually am like. Because we talk about it a lot in when we're studying, and because I'd come from this experience where I had a different kind of relationship with people at school, with families and children. So I actually am aware that I don't disclose a lot, but there are certain things that I think that I can say that feel easy and relevant and supportive to clients like in my experience. So I don't necessarily share a lot, which is I thought I might be more of a sharer, and having had some therapists myself who were sharers.
Yeah.
But still it is important to me to say I understand and to find a way to say that.
And I like how you say it there. Like, that feels like a one wonderful option is that kind of general in my experience where, we might be encompassing what happened for us, what we've noticed in our practice, what we might have read in theory, rather than just with a client, this is just you.
Exactly.
It's almost a way of saying, this is not just you.
Yeah. And particularly because I do incorporate a lot of, somatic work and mindfulness in my work. Mindfulness has had a bit of a bad rap, particularly with young people, because we tried to put it into schools and I don't think we did very well. But it's important then for me to say, I do this and it has helped me in a way that I think it will help you around rumination or anxiety, whatever. But that doesn't need to come with a story. But I think there's something in that comes with another bit of trust. Like, don't just trust me because I read this thing and it's how we help anxiety. Maybe there's a bit more trust because I'm telling you this is something that I do, and I can tell you that it's, in my experience, it's really helpful. Interestingly, I do notice that I am more likely to disclose with my queer clients. And I'm not entirely sure about. Maybe it's part of that being part of a marginalised community, that it's important to have moments of connection, just always, when we're with other members of the community. And sometimes there's some assumed shared understandings too that, interesting. I reflect on that often and think, that's not necessarily something I would have said to a straight person.
I find that with my queer clients, and I also, because I've written about my family in some ways, I've written about my brother dying when he was young and the impact on me. I do get, people who come for that, who want to talk about that, and like you, I find it can cascade in a good way with the kind of assumptions of other shared experiences.
Yeah.
But I like the way you're kind of putting this on a continuum as well. Like, when I think about when you're talking about mindfulness, I have found it really helpful to say to people, no, this has never worked for me, this particular way, but this does work for some people, or I have, done this as an alternative. And again, it feels like what you're saying is, it's not just you.
Yeah.
It's not just you having a problem with this technique. It's not just you who've had this experience. But I'm wondering, because we're talking about clients, I'm wondering what you think about it in terms of your peers or your professions. Because, we talked about also how so many therapists have been sanctioned for self-disclosure. For saying they're autistic, or for talking about histories of sexual assault or family violence on social media, or what do you think about how important it is for us to talk to each other about this is why I came into the profession, or this is my history and the therapy that's helped me, or...
Yeah, it is really interesting, because of course I think we should be at the forefront of breaking down these ideas that if you've experienced certain things, you're a bit broken, or if you're autistic that you can't be a therapist. Like, of course it should be us at the forefront here saying these things make us who we are and contribute in so many ways and in really positive ways to our practice. So I think it is really important that we speak with each other about these things. I'm thinking about, I went to a MHPN,
Mental Health Professionals Network.
That's it, yeah. Was it for people who work with neurodivergent clients? And like, that was a great example of that, because of course most of the people there were also neurodivergent, because same deal, we're, you know, often called in to work with clients where we have some particular interest because of our lived experience. And that was a really good example of people in there absolutely talking about their lived experience, also sharing work with clients, you know, their client work and resources. It was just this pile on of fabulous resources to go away with. So I do think it's happening more, and I do think it's really important because we can learn from each other too. And we learn from each other's experiences. And I think, you know, it's helpful to be able to say, you know, perhaps this is a client I work with or a cohort I work with that I don't share a lived experience. Why can't I perhaps check in with a colleague who has their own experience as well as their client work? And I might get, you know, more of a depth of understanding or knowledge from that.
And there's something too in what you're talking about, you know, about that kind of intersection of the experiences you have and the experiences you don't have. Like I found myself saying to a client years ago, you know, who was autistic, saying, I am not autistic, but I have so many family members who are. So I'm saying that to you because I think there are things that I will understand, but there are also things not only that I won't understand, but I might have extra difficulty with because of that positioning. Yeah. And so what do you think, like make up your mind about whether this is what you would like. But it was also kind of information for me about the work that I needed to do.
Yeah.
And the support I needed, I guess, from my own colleagues as well.
Yeah. But, you know, again, thinking about what we share with our colleagues, of course we're much more likely to talk about neurodivergence than we are about sexual assault. So still those taboos sit there.
And what do you think that, like, I find it really, it's almost, and I'm not sure if this is right, like, it feels like we go back then with childhood sexual assault, with sexual assault, with family violence, with childhood violence. I feel like we go back to Freud, and, you know, I'm not dissing the whole back catalogue of Freud, but we go back to Freud and this idea that these experiences are kind of toxic and contaminating to the relationship, and they need to be cleaned up and bracketed, or else, you know, they're going to do terrible things in the room. They're going to cloud our judgment. Our clients are going to carry them. I'm wondering, like, what for you are the real positives of those really negative experiences, you know, really kind of cracking experiences, particularly as a child, in the room with your clients?
I think some of the really positive stuff is knowing about post-traumatic growth, having experienced it, and also just this sense, but I do have to be careful with this too, that for me, my experiences have made me who I am. They've made me interested and called to this work, called to work with children, you know, like I specifically did for many years. And that as well as a lot of therapy, obviously, sets me up really well. I like who I am, and I feel like I don't need to deny or hide my life's experience because it's made me who I am. So that, I think, bringing that into the room, I wouldn't be looking at a client at any point thinking, you will never recover from this. Or, this is it for you. Or you're broken. Or this, you can't live with a wound and be fabulous or have a great life. But when I say I need to be careful of that too, I also understand that for some people coming into therapy, they're not in that place, and it's not necessarily helpful to say, but it's made you who you are, because for them it might be, I don't want to be like this. I wish that had never happened so I could be someone else. And that's okay too. So I guess the positive thing is when you've lived with adversity and through adversity, like many of us have, and know that it can still, nip at your heels sometimes, but you can have, a life well lived, then that's a really useful thing to know as a therapist. And I think energetically even to have in the room that belief and that trust and faith in our clients' innate ability to heal and that internal drive to heal.
I love that when you're talking about that, I'm really hearing the way that disclosed or not disclosed, it sits underneath as an attitude of, I suppose, an opposing attitude to you need to be fixed, you need to be cleaned up, or this will always be broken for you.
Yeah.
None of which we know. And that feels so important. So how that experience really just kind of informs your attitude that you bring into the room and how that really communicates.
Yeah, I think it's, for me it's around integration, which is so much of the work that we do, isn't it? Is bringing all the parts together to feel whole and integrated. I'm probably quoting Dan Siegel at this point. He talks about integration a lot, but it's not, there's not judgment that comes along with that.
It was I was having a conversation with someone saying that we were going to talk about this, and I had it was such a transformative experience because I had never heard this before. She said to me that this still happened to her, that she'd experienced childhood sexual assault and lots of violence, and if somebody knocked into her in the wrong place of her body, she would automatically, hit them back, lash out, and that this was a completely unconscious response, despite, 20 years of therapy. And it was the first time I had heard somebody disclose what happened to me for years. It doesn't happen anymore, but it's really only been maybe 10 years that it hasn't. But I'd never heard anybody talk about that, let alone, another therapist. And it made me think about, when you're talking about colleagues, how do we kind of accommodate not just the stories of what we experienced, but the real things that we do still live with from that, whether it's the shame or whether it's my colleague who has to live with, once every 2 years she'll smack someone on the train and have to deal with that because they've hurt her. How do we do that?
Well, I think this is one of the gifts of therapy, is understanding the context of our lives so that it makes sense why we do certain things. Or even if we don't quite know, we know that there will be a reason. So I think that sets us up well to be able to accommodate and understand, and in the same way that we would with our clients, where we might compassionately say, well, of course you would do that. Of course you would. And that, what a wonderful thing that is to be able to do for people. So I think we should be able to do that for each other too, and bring that compassion, and ideally that's coming in as self-compassion as well, for people to be able to perhaps disclose enough to say, you know how it is sometimes that this from so long ago has led to this that happens now sometimes, that I might need a bit of care around.
Yeah, I like that what you're talking about there, of this sort of ongoing compassion for each other, of self-compassion for not just, again, like with your clients, how can we fix this or clean this up, but how can we make this easier for ourselves while we work?
Yeah.
How can we support each other to, like our clients, not see these as terrible deficits we're coming into the room with? What kind of supervision, what kind of communities, what kind of, as you say, kind of professional development, where we can really center that lived experience we all have.
Yeah, and just normalize it. And I think, which is, again, what we do for our clients all the time. And I think about, we talk a lot more now about sensory needs, which I think has been a really great opening to talk about a lot of different things, because, of course, our sensory, the way we take in sensory information shifts depending on all kinds of things, like our stress levels, our life experience, our fabulous brains, whatever they're doing in the moment.
Hormones.
Oh, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So many things. But I find that a really, a useful entry point too, because we can talk about senses now in a way that's a bit different, to be able to say or identify, for example, being really jumpy with loud noises, which happens to me when I'm stressed.
You and me both.
Yeah. And it's comical at times how much I'll jump from, dropping a saucepan lid or something, but at a different time it might not be the case. But I find that really helpful, and I do it with clients as well, to just name how sometimes our sensory needs are different. And you can change the lights in my room. We can take the smell away. We can add heat, and there's a blanket, and there's soft things, to talk about that. And we can do that, I think, with colleagues as well. Of
Yes.
just like, what are your sensory needs? And it's a way to be able to talk about things that is... we all have them, regardless of whether you have had childhood trauma or not.
Thank you for that. That's really, I love that as a kind of a way to tie in everything we've talked about today. How are we kind of responding to those lived experiences that we have in the moment, ongoingly, in a really compassionate and respectful way? Thank you so much for this conversation. I've been really wanting to have this for such a long time, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been really lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by the Karen Miller Institute. Karen Miller is founded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to land, waters, and community. The legacies of colonization and the ongoing effects of institutional racism have enduring impacts on the mental health and well-being of First Nations people, and we hold this continuing dispossession in our minds and hearts as we explore the question of how to improve our work in the mental health field. Karen Miller is more than just a not-for-profit organization. is a vibrant community of students, clients, staff, alumni, and generous donors. Our hearts beat for better mental health, which has driven us for over 60 years. At CMI, we believe in a dynamic interplay between training, research, and clinical practice. These three pillars form our triple helix, each strengthening and informing the other as a registered health promotion charity. We've been pioneers in counselling and psychotherapy in Australia, and our purpose is to enhance mental health through accessible psychological services and innovative professional education. That's where How's That Working For You comes in. This podcast is our way of sharing the extraordinary insights, anecdotes, and life lessons from the mental health field. We're pulling back the curtain to offer you a unique peek behind the scenes, aiming to deepen your understanding of this remarkable space. I'm a senior lecturer at CMI. I'm a feminist psychotherapist, supervisor, and researcher. I've worked in agencies and in private practice, and I've trained in a number of modalities, including emotion-focused therapy and existential psychotherapy, and I have a primary interest in anti-oppressive practice. Thank you for listening to How's That Working For You, a podcast for the therapy curious. This has been your host, Dr. Zoe Krupka. This podcast is a space for open conversations, but it's important to remember that what you're hearing are the personal experiences and thoughts of me and of our guests. While we're here to share insights, please don't take any of this as advice. We're all wonderfully unique, so if you have therapeutic concerns, it's best to chat with your healthcare professional. This podcast was brought to you by the Karen Miller Institute. For more information about our organization, the services we offer, and how to donate, visit our website at cmi.edu.au. You can find links and more information about each guest in our episode show notes. Find us on all major podcast platforms and stay tuned for more inspiring episodes.